The Circuit of the Americas didn't just host a race. It subjected it to a trial by fire. It was late October in Austin, Texas, but the afternoon sun beat down on the blacktop with the unforgiving malice of high summer. Heat waves shimmered above the start-finish straight, turning the grandstands into a blurred, impressionistic painting of roaring fans and waving flags. The air tasted of vaporized aviation fuel, melting Pirelli rubber, and the ozone tang of electrified kinetic energy. Inside the cavernous garage of Apex Racing, the noise was a physical weight. The scream of the hybrid V6 power units reverberated through the concrete floors, vibrating up through the soles of shoes and rattling the teeth in a mechanic's skull. But at the telemetry station, situated in the darkest, coolest corner of the garage, Leo Vance existed in a sanctuary of absolute silence. Leo wore a heavy pair of noise-canceling headset earmuffs, drowning out the visceral chaos of the physical world. He didn't watch the track monitors. He didn't look at the glittering, multi-million-dollar chassis tearing through the Texas heat. Leo watched the ghosts they left behind. Before him stretched an arc of 6 high-definition monitors, each overflowing with cascading waterfalls of data. To the untrained eye, it was a chaotic blizzard of jagged line graphs, hexadecimal codes, and scrolling numbers in neon green, red, and blue. To Leo, it was a living, breathing organism. He could see the pulse of the engine, the expanding lungs of the air intakes, the electrical nervous system firing through miles of optic wiring. He could feel the car better than the driver could. And right now, the car was flying. Coming into Sector 3, Jax. The race engineer's voice crackled over the secure comms channel. Pace is green. You are 2/10 up on your personal best. Copy, came the breathless, strained reply. Mia Jax Jackson was currently pulling 4.5 GS through the sweeping right-hander of turn 17. Even through the radio static, Leo could hear the sheer physical exertion in her voice, the tight compression of her diaphragm as the lateral forces tried to rip her helmet off her shoulders. Jax was a kinetic force of nature. In an era where drivers were increasingly treated as biological extensions of the onboard computers, Jax drove by the seat of her fireproof suit. She was aggressive, intuitive, and possessed a preternatural ability to find grip where the algorithms swore none existed. She was Apex Racing's star, the reigning prodigy who had dragged an underperforming car into championship contention through sheer, bloody-minded willpower. Leo's eyes darted across his screens. Tire core temperatures were optimal. Downforce loads on the front wing were holding steady. The MGUK, the electric motor that harvested kinetic energy under braking, was operating at 98% efficiency. Everything was perfect. It was the final practice session, FP3, just 2 hours before the all-important qualifying, and they were dialed in. Jax tore down the long back straight, the slipstream fluttering over the aerodynamic carbon fiber bodywork. The speedometer on Leo's second screen ticked upward with terrifying speed.
310 km/h, 320.
335. Ahead lay turn 12. It was one of the most brutal braking zones on the Formula One calendar. The drivers had to stamp on the carbon ceramic brakes, decelerating from over 200 miles per hour to a crawling 50 in the span of just 100 meters. It required utter faith in the machine. Braking zone in 3, 2. Leo muttered to himself, his eyes locked on the brake-by-wire pressure telemetry. Jax hit the pedal. On the screen, the green line representing hydraulic brake pressure spiked vertically. But beside it, the yellow line, representing the electronic command sent from the pedal to the rear brake calipers, stuttered. It wasn't a drop. It wasn't a failure. It was a plateau. A perfectly flat, microscopic shelf in the data curve. Leo's breath hitched. He hit a key, freezing the telemetry frame on his third monitor while the live feed continued on the others. He zoomed in on the yellow line, expanding the x-axis from tenths of a second down to milliseconds. There it was. 14 milliseconds. For 14 thousandths of a second, the car's electronic control unit, the central brain of the vehicle, had paused. It had received Jax's command to engage the rear brakes, but it had waited 14 milliseconds before telling the actuators to clamp down on the spinning carbon discs. At 200 miles per hour, 14 milliseconds equated to over 4 feet of distance traveled. For feet, in a sport where missing an apex by 2 inches meant slamming into a concrete barrier at fatal speeds. "Jax, this is Vance," Leo said, pressing the transmit button on his console, overriding the standard pit wall hierarchy. How did the pedal feel into turn 12? Any softness? There was a pause, filled only by the screaming whine of the MGUH as Jax accelerated out of the corner. Negative, Leo. Pedal is stiff. Bite is good. Why? Just checking a blip on the downtrace, Leo said, frowning deeply. Keep pushing. Box at the end of this lap. Copy that. Boxing. Leo tore his headset off just as a shadow fell over his monitors. Tell me why my telemetry engineer is interrogating my lead driver about ghost blips during her fastest run of the weekend. A voice demanded, smooth but lined with razor wire. Leo didn't look up immediately. He knew the voice, the scent of expensive Tom Ford cologne, and the impeccable tailoring of the man standing behind him. Julian Thorne, team principal of Apex Racing. Julian was a man who viewed racing not as a mechanical pursuit, but as an exercise in corporate warfare. To him, the car was a billboard that moved at 200 miles per hour, and the data was only useful if it justified his budget to the board of directors. I didn't interrogate her, Julian, Leo said, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he pulled the raw logs from the car's onboard memory buffer. I asked for a physical confirmation of an anomalous data point. Anomalous, Julian repeated, leaning over Leo's shoulder. His reflection glared back from the dark glass of the monitor. Sharp jawline, perfectly styled silver hair, eyes like chipped flint. I don't care about anomalies, Leo. I care about pole position. We are currently 1/10 of a second behind the Centurion team. If she feels confident in the brakes, leave it alone. Do not put ghosts in her head. It's not a ghost in her head, Julian. It's a ghost in the telemetry, Leo countered, pointing a pen at the frozen graph. Look at this plateau. Turn 12. Heavy braking event. The brake-by-wire system experienced a 14 millisecond latency between pedal input and actuator response. Julian squinted at the screen, unimpressed. 14 milliseconds. Are you joking? A human eye blinks in 300. A human eye doesn't travel 300 feet per second. Leo shot back, his tone hardening. If this latency scales up, or if it happens in a high G corner where she's trail braking, it will upset the brake bias. The rears will lock. She'll spin out. Best case scenario, we ruin a set of soft tires and abort a qualifying lap. Worst case scenario, she goes backward into the Armco barrier at 150 miles an hour. Julian's jaw tightened. The mention of a crash, and the millions of dollars in carbon fiber damage it entailed, always caught his attention. You think it's a sensor glitch? I think it's a sensor glitch, Leo lied. He didn't know what it was yet, but he knew how to manage Julian. I just need 10 minutes with the ECU when the car gets back to the garage to clear the logic cache and run a diagnostic. No big deal. Julian checked his gold Patek Philippe watch. You have exactly 10 minutes, Vance. Then the FIA puts the cars in park firm conditions before qualifying. If we touch the car after the deadline, we start from the pit lane. Do not screw this up. Julian turned on his heel and strode back toward the glaring light of the pit lane, barking orders at a group of aerodynamicists. Leo exhaled slowly, sliding his headset back over his ears. He watched the track feed. Jax was bringing the sleek, dark blue and silver Apex chassis down the pit lane. The car looked like a predator returning to its den, heat rippling off the engine cover, the tires blistered and scarred from the sheer violence of the run. The moment the car stopped in the garage box, chaos erupted. A dozen mechanics swarmed the vehicle. They jacked the chassis up, sliding cooling fans into the side pods to prevent the hybrid batteries from cooking themselves alive. The smell of scorched brakes and hot resin filled the air. Jax unbuckled her steering wheel and tossed it onto the halo bar before pulling herself out of the narrow cockpit. She stripped off her balaclava, shaking out her damp, dark hair. Her face was flushed, coated in a fine sheen of sweat and carbon dust, but her eyes were electric. She looked over at the telemetry desk and caught Leo's eye, giving him a thumbs up. Leo didn't return the gesture. He grabbed a heavy-duty fiber optic cable from his rack, stood up, and moved quickly through the swarm of mechanics. "Clear the port! Clear the port!" Leo muttered, elbowing past the chief mechanic, who was busy checking the suspension wishbones. Leo plugged the thick yellow cable directly into the car's primary diagnostic port, located just behind the roll hoop. He didn't trust the wireless telemetry for this. Wireless data was compressed, filtered for bandwidth. He wanted the raw, unadulterated hex code straight from the brain of the machine. Returning to his station, Leo cracked his knuckles and began to type. He bypassed the standard diagnostic software provided by the FIA. That software was designed to look for hardware failures, broken wires, overheating chips, shattered sensors. Leo wasn't looking for a hardware failure. A hardware failure in a sensor usually produced a jagged, erratic signal. The plateau he had seen was too clean, too perfect. It looked like an instruction. He dove into the command line interface, his eyes scanning the endless streams of white text scrolling against the black background. He isolated the data packet from the exact timestamp of the turn 12 braking event. 14 hours 32 minutes and 41.092 seconds. He unpacked the packet. Initialize BBW_override. Check MG_load. Delay_ms. 14. Execute_actuator_clamp. Leo stopped breathing. The ambient noise of the garage, the shouting mechanics, the whirring fans. It all faded into a dull, underwater hum. He read the lines of code again and again. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't a degraded sensor or a short circuit in the wiring loom. It was a subroutine. Someone had written a line of code and buried it deep within the brake-by-wire controller. The logic was insidious in its simplicity. It was designed to monitor the load on the MGUK. When the car was under maximum braking force, only at the absolute peak of deceleration, the code would trigger, forcibly injecting a micro-delay into the rear brake calipers. 14 milliseconds. Just enough to unsettle the rear axle. Just enough to make the car feel loose, unpredictable. In a sport built on driver confidence, it was a psychological weapon. If Jax didn't trust the brakes, she would start braking earlier. She would lose hundredths of a second at every corner. Over a 56-lap race, those hundredths would compound into seconds. She would lose the race and no one would ever know why. They would blame tire degradation. They would blame aerodynamic setup. They would blame the driver. But there was something else. A variable that made Leo's blood run cold. He highlighted the variable in the code. Delay_ms. Variable_x. The delay wasn't hard-coded at 14 milliseconds. It was a scaling integer. The code was designed to increase the latency with every subsequent actuation. 14 milliseconds on lap 10. 20 milliseconds on lap 20. By lap 50, the delay would be over 100 milliseconds. If Jax hit the brakes at 200 miles an hour with a 100 millisecond delay on the rear axle, the brake bias would shift violently to the front. The front tires would lock instantly. The car would become an unguided missile. This wasn't just corporate espionage. This wasn't just someone trying to steal championship points. This was sabotage. Lethal sabotage. Leo jumped, his knee cracking against the underside of the metal desk. Jax was standing beside him, a bottle of water in her hand, the towel draped around her neck stained with sweat. Her dark eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "You look like you just saw a ghost," she said, taking a sip of water. "I did," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of another engine firing up in the adjacent garage. He looked at the glowing lines of malicious code. The ECU was a closed ecosystem. It was heavily encrypted, protected by military-grade firewalls, and sealed by the FIA to prevent traction control cheating. The only way to introduce a phantom command like this was through a direct, hardwired connection. Someone inside this garage, someone wearing an Apex Racing uniform, had plugged into Jax's car and planted a digital bomb. "Jax," Leo said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. He reached out and hit a sequence of keys, encrypting his monitor and turning the screen pitch black. "We need to talk. Not here. Somewhere without cameras." Jax's brow furrowed. The casual confidence of the athlete melted away, replaced by the acute wariness of a survivor. She looked around the garage at the mechanics, the engineers, and finally at Julian Thorne, who was standing at the edge of the pit lane, talking animatedly on his phone. "What did you find, Leo?" she asked, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Your car is perfectly fine," Leo said, looking her dead in the eye. "But if you drive it tomorrow, it's going to kill you." The server room at Apex Dynamics was a cathedral of cold, calculated silence, broken only by the deafening, omnipresent roar of climate control and the high-pitched whine of cooling fans. Row upon row of black steel racks stretched into the gloom, their faces dotted with thousands of blinking LEDs that looked like the neurotic, unblinking eyes of mechanical spiders. The air tasted of ozone, sterile floor wax, and the metallic tang of static electricity. Leo Vance knelt in the narrow aisle between Rack 42 and Rack 43, shivering. He wore a heavy wool sweater, but the chill of the room wasn't the only thing making his hands tremble. He was currently violating 32 separate clauses of his non-disclosure agreement, not to mention committing an act of corporate espionage that carried a federal prison sentence. He didn't care. The ghost in the telemetry from yesterday's track test was screaming at him, and Leo was the only one listening. A heavy, braided Ethernet cable ran from the primary diagnostic switch of the Vanguard hypercar's dedicated server bank directly into a modified, matte black laptop balanced precariously on Leo's knees. On the screen, a progress bar crawled with agonizing slowness. Asterisk 78%, 79%, asterisk. "Come on," Leo whispered, his breath pluming faintly in the frigid air. "Don't choke on me now." He was downloading the entirety of the Vanguard's proprietary source code, millions of lines of meticulously crafted algorithms that dictated every microsecond of the hypercar's existence. From the fuel injection timing to the active aerodynamics, the code was the brain of a beast capable of pushing 300 miles per hour. But hidden somewhere in that digital labyrinth was the anomaly. The glitch that had almost killed Mia Jackson on the salt flats 24 hours ago. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Heavy, rhythmic. The night watchman. Leo froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached out, his thumb hovering over the abort key. If he killed the transfer now, he'd leave a corrupted packet trail. The intrusion detection software would flag it by morning. He needed a clean mirror. Asterisk 88%, 89%, asterisk. The footsteps grew louder. The beam of an LED flashlight swept across the frosted glass doors of the server room, casting long, warped shadows over the racks. Leo crouched lower, making himself as small as possible, his eyes locked on the screen. He dimmed his laptop's brightness to 0, plunging himself into the ambient, chaotic strobe of the server lights. Asterisk 95%, 97%, asterisk. The flashlight beam lingered on the door handle. The watchman paused. Leo held his breath, the blood rushing in his ears completely drowning out the hum of the servers. Asterisk, don't open it. Please don't open it. Asterisk. The beam swept away. The footsteps resumed, fading down the linoleum hallway toward the structural engineering wing. Leo exhaled a ragged breath as the laptop chimed softly. Asterisk transfer complete. 100%. Asterisk. He didn't waste a second. He yanked the cable from the switch, snapped the laptop shut, and shoved it into his reinforced messenger bag. He slipped out of the server room like a ghost himself, navigating the labyrinthine, blue-lit corridors of Apex Dynamics until he reached the employee parking garage. He didn't look back. Leo's apartment was the antithesis of the pristine corporate labs at Apex. It was a sprawling, dimly lit loft in the industrial district, littered with empty espresso cups, cannibalized circuit boards, and stacks of hard drives. Rain lashed against the massive, iron-framed windows, smearing the neon lights of the city into blurred streaks of crimson and gold. It was 3:14 a.m., Leo sat at his customized workstation, an arc of 3 curved monitors illuminating his exhausted face in a pale, ghastly blue. His eyes burned, red-rimmed and dry, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins kept him hyper-focused. He took a sip of cold, bitter coffee and cracked his knuckles. "All right, you son of a bitch," Leo muttered to the empty room. "Show yourself." He booted his private server, entirely air-gapped from the outside world, and loaded the Vanguard source code into a bespoke sandbox environment he had built from scratch. He began to run the raw hex data through a visualization matrix, looking for the anomaly he had spotted in the track telemetry. In Chapter 1, the anomaly had manifested as a microscopic latency, a 12-millisecond delay in the break-by-wire system, accompanied by a phantom spike in the ECU's torque request. It was so small that the lead engineers had dismissed it as sensor noise. But Leo was the lead data architect. He knew the Vanguard's nervous system better than he knew his own. Code didn't just stutter. It was interrupted. He set his search parameters to isolate any subroutines that executed outside the standard sequential logic during the exact timestamp of the test run's anomaly. For an hour, there was nothing. Just endless rivers of elegant, optimized C++ and machine code. Then, at 4:22 a.m., the compiler threw an exception. A block of code, buried deep within the transmission control module, was heavily encrypted. It was obfuscated using a polymorphic cipher, meaning it actively rewrote its own signature to evade detection. "Sneaky," Leo breathed, leaning closer to the monitors. "You're hiding in the blind spot of the diagnostic sweeps." He routed his processing power to crack the cipher, utilizing a brute force algorithm combined with a dictionary of Apex Dynamics' proprietary cryptographic keys. The fans of his desktop rig roared to life, sounding like a miniature jet turbine. The screens flashed with cascading alphanumeric strings. 10 minutes later, the encryption shattered. The payload lay bare. Leo began to read the decrypted lines of code, translating the complex syntax into physical actions in his mind. As he unspooled the logic, his stomach plummeted. The ambient chill of the apartment suddenly felt freezing. This wasn't a glitch. It wasn't poorly optimized telemetry. It was a weapon. The malware was dormant, acting as a passive observer on the Vanguard's CAN bus network, silently monitoring the car's sensor data. It was waiting for a highly specific set of parameters to be met simultaneously. Condition A: vehicle speed exceeds 210 miles per hour. Condition B: lateral g-force is neutral, driving in a straight line. Condition C: engine RPM reaches exactly 8,500, the absolute redline of the twin-turbo V8. "What happens at redline?" Leo whispered, his fingers flying across the keyboard to trace the execution path. When the threshold was met, the payload would inject a localized, high-priority command into the vehicle's electronic control unit. It was designed to do 2 things simultaneously, both of them fatal. First, it would trigger a localized ghost-braking event. It commanded the ABS module to clamp the front left and rear right brake calipers at maximum hydraulic pressure for exactly 0.4 seconds, while leaving the other 2 wheels spinning freely. At 210 miles per hour, that asymmetrical drag would instantaneously snap the hypercar into a violent, uncontrollable flat spin. But the code didn't stop there. Second, it bypassed the engine's rev limiter and wastegate safety protocols. It instructed the fuel injectors to flood the combustion chambers while simultaneously retarding the ignition timing and sealing the exhaust valves. Leo pushed his chair back, feeling genuinely nauseous. At 8,500 revolutions per minute, flooding the block and sealing the exhaust would create immense, unvented hydrostatic lock and cylinder pressure. The engine block wouldn't just stall. It would detonate. Titanium rods would shatter. The magnesium casing would rip apart like shrapnel. The driver wouldn't just lose control. They would be trapped inside a tumbling 200-mile-per-hour fragmentation grenade. "They're trying to kill her," Leo said, the reality of the sabotage crashing down on him. A sudden, sharp knock at the loft door made him jump out of his skin. Leo scrambled to turn off the monitors, plunging the room into darkness, save for the ambient street light filtering through the rain-slicked windows. He moved silently toward the heavy steel door, picking up a heavy torque wrench from a nearby workbench. Leo, I know you're in there. I can hear your server rig from the hallway. The voice was muffled through the steel, but instantly recognizable. The smoky, adrenaline-laced tenor of Mia Jackson. Leo let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding, dropped the wrench, and threw the deadbolts. Jax stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone. She was wearing her leather motorcycle jacket over a faded graphic tee, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks. She looked pale, her usually piercing hazel eyes shadowed with exhaustion and something else, fear. Jax was never afraid. She was the woman who pushed prototype machines to the edge of the atmosphere without breaking a sweat. Jax? What the hell are you doing here at 4 in the morning? She pushed past him, walking into the loft and shaking off the rain like a stray dog. She smelled of wet leather, stale cigarette smoke, and high-octane anxiety. I couldn't sleep, she said, her voice tight. She paced across the hardwood floor, her boots clicking sharply. I closed my eyes, and all I could feel was the steering column vibrating. It fought me, Leo. Leo closed the door and locked it. The telemetry showed a minor latency spike. Engineering says. I don't give a damn what engineering says. Jax snapped, whirling around to face him. Her hands were trembling. She shoved them deep into her jacket pockets. I know that car. I've lived in that cockpit for 8 months. When I hit the top of 4th gear yesterday, the Vanguard didn't just twitch. Tried to kill me. The wheel went dead in my hands, and the rear end felt like it was chained to a concrete block for a split second. If I hadn't lifted off the throttle, I would have rolled it. Leo stared at her, the weight of the decrypted code burning a hole in his consciousness. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to turn the monitors back on and show her the digital loaded gun pointed at her head. But if he did, Jax would march into Apex Dynamics at dawn and tear the place apart. She'd alert the saboteur, and Leo would go to prison for data theft before he could find out who it was. I believe you, Leo said softly. Jax blinked, the fight draining out of her shoulders. She let out a ragged sigh and leaned against the edge of his workbench. You do.
Ido.
The data. There's something there. I'm looking into it. Then fix it, Leo. Because Thorne is pushing for the high-speed certification test on Friday. He wants me to take it to the Redline. He wants 220 miles per hour for the board of directors. Leo's blood ran cold. Condition C, engine RPM reaches exactly 8,500. The Redline. Friday. You can't drive that car on Friday, Jax. I have to, she said, shaking her head. If I back out, Thorne will put Reynolds in the seat. Reynolds doesn't have the reaction time to catch a snap oversteer at 200. If the car glitches with him in it, he's dead. Jax, listen to me. Leo stepped closer, his voice urgent, commanding. Do not get in that car. Stall. Fake an illness. Tell them the suspension feels soft. I don't care what you do, but you cannot take the Vanguard to the Redline. Promise me. She searched his face, her eyes narrowing as she read the absolute terror radiating from him. She knew him well enough to know he wasn't prone to hyperbole. What did you find, Leo? She whispered. I don't have the whole picture yet. He lied smoothly, though his heart hammered. But the software is unstable. If you push it to the limit, it will fail catastrophically. I just need a little more time to prove it to the board. Jax stared at him for a long moment, the rain lashing against the glass behind her. Finally, she gave a stiff nod. You have until Thursday night, Vance. After that, I'm getting in the car. I won't let Thorne cancel the project because of a ghost. She turned and headed for the door, pausing with her hand on the deadbolt. Find the ghost, Leo, before it finds me. When the door clicked shut, leaving Leo alone in the shadows, he didn't move for a long time. The scent of her rain-soaked leather lingered in the air, a visceral reminder of the human life hanging in the balance. He walked back to his workstation and powered the monitors back on. The deadly lines of code stared back at him, mocking him. All right, Leo muttered, sliding into his chair. You built a bomb. Now let's see where you bought the parts. The code had to have a point of origin. Malware this sophisticated wasn't written on a smartphone, and it wasn't beamed in via a Wi-Fi hack. It had deep-level access to the Vanguard's architecture, which meant it was compiled using Apex Dynamics proprietary development kits. It was an inside job. Leo opened a new terminal window and began writing a tracer script. If the saboteur had compiled the code internally, the compiler would have stamped the executable with a digital fingerprint, a metadata tag detailing the machine ID, the network node, and the IP address where it was birthed. Whoever wrote it had scrubbed the metadata. But Leo was a data architect. He knew that data never truly disappeared. It just left echoes. He initiated a forensic reconstruction of the file's headers, peeling back the layers of obfuscation. He bypassed the spoofed MAC addresses, tunneling through the virtual private networks the saboteur had erected to cover their tracks. He routed his trace through the server logs he had stolen, cross-referencing the timestamp of the malware's creation with the active internal network nodes at Apex. Node found. The script locked onto an IP address. Leo leaned forward, his eyes darting across the screen. The IP address wasn't in the engineering subnet. It wasn't in the software development wing, or the telemetry labs, or even the off-site testing facilities. It was on the secure executive subnet. 10.0.0.12. No way, Leo breathed. He opened a secondary window, accessing a cached copy of the Apex Dynamics internal directory. He typed in the IP address, his fingers feeling suddenly numb. The database queried the directory, matching the static IP to an assigned office and terminal. The screen flashed green, displaying the result in stark, unfeeling text. IP assignment *10.0.0.12 location *Tower 1. Floor 40. Executive Suite. User *Thorn Julian. Title *Chief of Operations. Leo stared at the name, the glow of the monitor reflecting in his wide eyes. Julian Thorn. The man pushing the Vanguard project. The man demanding the Redline certification test on Friday. The man who had personally hired Jax as the test pilot. Thorn hadn't just ignored the anomaly. He had authored it. He had intentionally written a piece of malware designed to turn his own company's billion-dollar hypercar into a bomb. He wanted the Vanguard destroyed, and he wanted Mia Jackson to die in the wreckage, taking the blame for a catastrophic driver error. Why? Leo whispered to the empty room, the chilling reality sinking its claws into his chest. He looked at the decrypted code, then at the name on the screen. The ghost in the telemetry wasn't a glitch, and it wasn't a mistake. It was first-degree murder, written in C++, waiting for the tachometer to hit 8,500 revolutions per minute. Leo grabbed his coffee cup, his hand shaking so badly the dark liquid sloshed over the rim, staining his desk. He had 2 days to stop an assassination, and the man holding the trigger was his boss. The glow of the quad monitors cast a sickly, pallid luminescence across Leo Vance's face, turning the cramped confines of the trackside server room into a digital purgatory. Outside the reinforced aluminum walls, the Singapore night was a suffocating blanket of equatorial heat and humidity, split only by the neon glare of the Marina Bay Street circuit. But inside, the air conditioning blasted at a sterile 60 degrees, humming with the relentless vibration of a dozen high-speed data servers. Leo didn't feel the chill. A bead of sweat, cold and sharp, traced the ridge of his spine. His fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard, trembling imperceptibly. The screen before him was a cascade of compiled code. But it wasn't telemetry anymore. It wasn't the ghost in the machine he had been chasing for the past 48 hours. The insidious lines of malware buried deep in the engine control unit of Mia Jackson's car. No, this was something far worse. This was the why. For hours, Leo had used a backdoor he'd coded during his time at MIT, peeling back the layers of the encrypted malware he'd discovered yesterday. The malicious code was designed to create microstutters in the fuel injection system, fractions of a second where the engine would starve, causing a catastrophic loss of downforce in high-speed corners. It was meant to look like a mechanical failure, a tragic consequence of pushing an engine to the razor's edge of its physical limits. But Leo had followed the packet routing. He had traced the execution commands back from the car's ECU, through the team's secure paddock network, out into the sprawling dark web, and finally into an encrypted ledger. He tapped the enter key. The decryption script finished its brute force assault. The black terminal screen flooded with green text. Leo leaned in, his breath hitching in his throat. The ledger opened, revealing a sprawling, labyrinthine network of offshore accounts, shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, and decentralized cryptocurrency wallets. It was a dark money syndicate, a shadow market operating entirely out of the public eye. And they were betting heavily. He cross-referenced the timestamps. During the practice session in Melbourne 3 weeks ago, precisely 4 seconds before Jax's throttle mysteriously cut out on turn 9, a massive short position had been placed against their team's publicly traded stock. During the qualifying round in Bahrain, milliseconds prior to her brake-by-wire system locking up, a 7-figure wager had been executed on a rival team taking pole position. Millions of dollars were moving in absolute lockstep with the car's anomalies. But the true horror, the realization that made the stale coffee churn violently in Leo's stomach, was the digital signature authenticating the syndicate's escrow accounts. It was heavily masked, routed through proxy servers in Estonia and Macau, but the initial encryption key was a proprietary sequence. It belonged to the team's executive board. More specifically, it belonged to Julian Thorne. "My God!" Leo whispered to the empty room. His voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the whir of the cooling fans. Julian Thorne, the immaculate silver-haired team principal who had built the outfit from the ground up, was sabotaging his own star driver. The syndicate wasn't just some outside cartel. It was the board itself. They had realized that the dark money betting markets offered returns exponentially higher than a championship purse. Jax wasn't a driver to them anymore. She was a rigged roulette wheel spinning at 200 miles an hour. And Thorne was the croupier holding the remote control. A soft, rhythmic clicking sound drew Leo's attention. He looked up. In the upper corner of the server room, the black dome of a CCTV camera was angled down at him. The tiny LED light next to the lens, usually a dormant, unblinking green, was now pulsing red.
Pan tilt zoom.
It had shifted. He was being watched. Panic, sharp and metallic, flared in his chest, but Leo forced it down. He couldn't afford to panic. If Thorne knew he had breached the ledger, Leo wouldn't just lose his job. In the high-stakes, multi-billion-dollar underworld of illegal syndicate racing, he would simply disappear. Moving with deliberate, forced casualness, Leo closed the terminal. He executed a scrubbing script, wiping his search history, clearing the cache, and burying the decryption key inside a seemingly innocuous folder containing suspension fluid temperature logs. He brought up the standard telemetry feeds, filling the screens with the colorful, dancing graphs of tire degradation and exhaust pressure. He stood, stretching his arms over his head as if shaking off the exhaustion of a long night's work. He kept his eyes averted from the camera, grabbed his tablet, and walked out of the freezing server room into the suffocating reality of the paddock. The garage was a temple of organized chaos. The Singapore dawn had not yet broken, but beneath the blinding halogen arrays, the mechanics were swarming the sleek, carbon fiber chassis of Jax's car. The smell of high-octane racing fuel, burnt rubber, and hot metal was intoxicating, a sensory assault that usually filled Leo with adrenaline. Today, it smelled like an execution chamber. Vance. The voice sliced through the cacophony of pneumatic drills and shouting engineers. Leo froze, his hand tightening around the edges of his telemetry tablet. He turned slowly. Julian Thorne stood near the pit wall monitors, a perfect silhouette of corporate lethality. Despite the crushing humidity that had the mechanics soaked in sweat, Thorne wore a bespoke, lightweight navy suit that looked as if it had been tailored onto his body. Not a single gray hair was out of place. He held a porcelain espresso cup in one hand, his pale blue eyes fixed on Leo with the terrifying, unblinking stillness of a reptile. "Julian," Leo said, forcing a weary, professional smile. He walked over, his legs feeling like lead. "You're down here early. Sleep is a luxury we cannot afford this weekend. Leo, the board expects results." Thorne took a slow sip of his espresso. The scent of roasted coffee beans and expensive Tom Ford cologne washed over Leo, masking the smell of the garage. I noticed the server room was drawing heavy power throughout the night. Our security grid flagged an unusual amount of processing bandwidth. Leo felt his pulse thundering in his ears, but he met Thorne's icy gaze without flinching. Aerodynamic simulations. I was running a predictive model on the new front wing iterations, trying to find us an extra 1/10 of a second in Sector 3. Thorne smiled. It was a razor-thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. Commendable dedication. But you know what they say about looking too closely at the data, Leo. Sometimes the noise is just noise. If you chase every little ghost in the machine, you might find yourself lost in the dark. Just trying to give Jax the best car possible, Leo replied, keeping his tone light, oblivious. Indeed, Thorne murmured. He set the espresso cup down on a steel workbench. Make sure the telemetry stream is stabilized for the first practice session. I want eyes on everything. And Leo. Yes, Julian? Keep your focus on the track. Leave the big picture to me. Thorne patted Leo's shoulder, a touch that felt like ice through Leo's shirt, and walked away, disappearing into the VIP hospitality suite. Leo exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His hands were shaking again. He looked down at the tablet. He had to warn Jax. He had to tell her that the machine she strapped herself into, the machine she trusted with her life at terminal velocities, was a rigged coffin. But how? Thorne's head of security, a hulking ex-mercenary named Graves, was already patrolling the perimeter of the garage, his earpiece firmly in place, his eyes scanning the crew. Every radio channel was recorded. Every text message on the team's intranet was monitored. The garage was wiretapped. There was no private space in the paddock. Leo watched the mechanics lower the car off the jacks. The Apex V12 was a masterpiece of aerodynamic violence, painted in the team's striking crimson and matte black livery. And standing next to it, pulling her fireproof balaclava over her head, was Mia Jax Jackson. Jax was a force of nature. Where Thorne was cold corporate calculation, Jax was pure, unadulterated fire. She was fiercely independent, possessing a supernatural instinct for grip and speed that no algorithm could quantify. She was the only reason the team was even in contention for the championship, fighting against the mechanical bad luck that had plagued her all season. Leo gripped his tablet and walked purposefully toward the car. He had one chance. Jax! Leo called out over the roar of a neighboring team firing up their engine. She turned, her dark eyes locking onto him through the visor aperture of her balaclava. She pulled her helmet off the resting peg and gave him a curt nod. Vance, tell me you fixed the lag in the brake-by-wire. If that pedal goes soft into turn 14 again, I'm going into the barriers. That's what I need to show you, Leo said. He stepped directly into her personal space, closer than professional decorum usually allowed. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Graves, the security chief, stop walking and turn toward them. Leo held the tablet up, positioning it so that his own body blocked the sightline from Graves and the overhead cameras. On the screen was a standard, highly complex scatter plot of brake temperatures. It looked entirely normal to anyone standing more than 2 feet away. Look at the entry phase on the data, Leo said loudly, projecting his voice for the benefit of the garage microphones. The temperature spikes here, which causes the software to temporarily throttle the hydraulic pressure. It's an aggressive safety override. Jax frowned, leaning in. That makes no sense. The carbon discs are designed to run hot. Why would the override trigger at 800 degrees? Exactly, Leo said. As Jax stared at the screen, Leo tapped a hidden macro sequence on the bottom bezel of the tablet. The scatter plot vanished. In its place, a block of stark, white text appeared on a black background. They are betting against you. Thorne is sabotaging the ECU. The car is rigged. Do not react. Leo watched Jax's eyes. He saw the text reflect in her dark irises as she read the words. For a fraction of a second, confusion clouded her gaze, followed instantly by a flash of disbelief. She looked up at Leo, her mouth opening to speak. Leo immediately tapped the screen, bringing the brake temperature graph back up. He shook his head, a microscopic, frantic motion. He widened his eyes, pleading silently. Jax's jaw clenched. The muscles in her neck pulled taut. She was a driver accustomed to processing massive amounts of data in a millisecond, trained to control her physical reactions while experiencing extreme G-forces. The mastery of her own biology saved them. She swallowed whatever explosive words were on her tongue and looked back at the graph. "So, what's the workaround?" she asked. Her voice was remarkably steady, though Leo could hear the dangerous, barely restrained tremor of fury beneath it. "I can't patch it from the pit wall," Leo said, speaking loudly again. He pointed to a specific cluster of data points. "The override is hard-coded into the primary ECU sequence. But—" He lowered his voice slightly, leaning in so his mouth was inches from her ear, disguised by the act of pointing at the screen. "There's an analog fail-safe," he whispered rapidly. "The yellow rotary dial on your steering wheel. Torque map setting 7. I rewired it last night. If you switch to position 7, it physically severs the connection to the wireless telemetry receiver. You'll go completely dark to the pit wall. No data out, no commands in." Jax didn't move. She stared at the screen. "If I do that, the engineers fly blind. I won't have fuel targets. I won't have tire deltas." "You'll have the car," Leo whispered back, "and they won't be able to kill the engine." Heavy footsteps approached from behind. Leo didn't need to look to know it was Graves. The sheer mass of the man seemed to displace the humid air around them. "Everything all right here, Vance?" Graves' voice was a low, gravelly rumble. Leo smoothly stepped back, dropping the tablet to his side. "Perfectly fine, Graves. Just running Jax through the braking deltas for Sector 2. The new pads are going to require a slightly different bias." Graves stared at him, his dark eyes suspicious, searching for a crack in Leo's facade. Then he looked at Jax. Jax picked up her carbon fiber helmet. Her face was a mask of utter, terrifying calm. The fierce, fiery driver had retreated, replaced by something much colder, much more dangerous. She looked at Graves, and then past him, up toward the tinted glass of the VIP suite where Julian Thorne was undoubtedly watching. "The data is crystal clear, Leo," Jax said, her voice ringing out in the garage. She pulled the helmet over her head, securing the chin strap with a sharp snap. Through the tinted visor, she was now an anonymous, armored gladiator. "I know exactly what I need to do out there." She climbed into the cockpit, sliding down into the narrow survival cell. As the mechanic stepped forward to strap her into the 6-point harness, she reached out and rested her gloved hand on the steering wheel. Her thumb brushed over the yellow rotary dial, resting gently on position 7. Leo took a step back, melting into the crowd of engineers. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but a strange sense of clarity washed over him. The board thought they were playing a game of numbers, manipulating a digital ledger from the safety of their shadows. They thought the car was just a machine they could control. But they had forgotten one fundamental variable, the one piece of the telemetry they couldn't hack. They had forgotten the driver. As the Apex V12 roared to life, a deafening, chest-rattling scream of combustion and fury, Leo looked up at the VIP suite. The glass was tinted, but he knew Thorne was there, waiting to cash in his chips. Leo gripped his tablet, his knuckles white. The syndicate had operated in the dark for far too long. Tonight, under the neon lights of Marina Bay, they were going to drag Thorne's shadow into the blinding light of terminal velocity, and they were going to burn the ledger to the ground. The air in the paddock tasted of vaporized rubber, high-octane fuel, and a suffocating metallic paranoia. Marina Bay was always a pressure cooker, an equatorial cauldron where the humidity wrapped around the formula circuits like a wet wool blanket. But tonight, beneath the blinding, surgical glare of 3,000 stadium halogens, the atmosphere in the Apollo racing garage was lethal. The digital countdown clock suspended above the central gantry glowed in a harsh, unforgiving crimson. 03:14:09 until lights out. Leo Vance stared at his glowing monitors, His reflection ghosted in the dual screens. The telemetry data that usually flowed like a vibrant, pulsing river of green and blue numbers had been violently severed. In its place, a brutalist wall of red text blinked with synchronized malice across every screen in the engineering bay. System lockdown. Protocol Aegis activated. Clearance level. Director. ****. Listen up, everyone. A voice drifted over the low, anxious murmur of the engineering pit. Leo didn't have to look up to see Julian Thorne. The technical director possessed a voice like aged scotch poured over crushed glass. Smooth, expensive, and fundamentally dangerous. Julian stood at the head of the data center, impeccably dressed in his tailored team polo and a titanium chronograph watch that cost more than Leo's entire apartment. "I know this is highly irregular for race day," Julian continued, projecting an aura of absolute, paternal calm. He paced slowly behind the rows of seated data analysts and race engineers. "But as you are all aware, we suffered a severe network intrusion during yesterday's qualifying. We believe an external syndicate is attempting to compromise our telemetry. To protect Jax's car, and to ensure the integrity of tonight's Grand Prix, I am initiating Protocol Aegis. The servers are now dark. No incoming or outgoing data packets. We run entirely on internal, precompiled analog systems until the checkered flag." A murmur of protest rippled through the bay. Running a modern, 1,000-horsepower hybrid hypercar blind, without real-time algorithmic adjustments, was akin to flying a fighter jet through a hurricane with the cockpit windows painted black. Leo's hands gripped the edge of his workstation. His knuckles were bone-white. External syndicate, he thought, the hypocrisy burning a hole in his stomach. "You are the syndicate, Julian." Over the past 48 hours, Leo had followed the digital breadcrumbs. He had found the ghost in the telemetry, the microscopic anomaly buried deep in the brake-by-wire system. He had decrypted the betrayal, tracing the sabotage directly to Julian's IP address. Julian had sold them out. He had taken a massive, dark money wager against his own team. The code injected into the car's engine control unit was designed to cascade into a total hydraulic failure at high speed. Specifically, going into turn 14, the fastest, most unforgiving braking zone on the circuit. Protocol Aegis wasn't a shield against hackers. It was a cage. Julian had locked down the servers so Leo couldn't purge the malicious code from the mainframe before the race began. Julian's polished leather shoes stopped right behind Leo's chair. The faint scent of bergamot and cedarwood wafted over Leo's shoulder. "Is there a problem, Mr. Vance?" Julian asked softly. The rest of the room couldn't hear the subtle, serrated edge in his tone. "You look pale." Leo forced his hands to uncurl. He turned his head just enough to meet Julian's cold, slate-gray eyes. "Running blind is a massive risk, Julian. The localized ECU might not handle the torque mapping without cloud support. If the brake bias shifts, the car will perform exactly as it is programmed to," Julian interrupted, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I assure you, Leo, every variable has been accounted for. Your job now is to sit back, watch the monitors, and enjoy the race. Do not attempt to bypass the firewall. The encryption is absolute." Julian patted Leo's shoulder, a heavy, warning weight, before turning to address the chief mechanic. Leo watched him walk away, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Julian was right about one thing. The mainframe was impenetrable from the terminal. The network was dead. But Julian had underestimated the ingenuity of a desperate data engineer. Leo reached down to his ankle. Hidden beneath his sock, strapped to his skin with athletic tape, was a heavy, archaic piece of hardware. A first-generation, military-grade encrypted flash drive. It wasn't connected to the cloud. It wasn't bound by Protocol Aegis. It was a blunt instrument in a digital world. He had less than 3 hours to build a rogue counter-algorithm, a digital parasite that could hunt down Julian's sabotage within the car's localized memory and kill it. But to deploy it, he would have to physically plug the drive into the car on the starting grid, right under Julian's nose. First, he needed Jax. Leo slipped out of his chair, grabbing his battered Panasonic Toughbook. He ducked under the scaffolding of the VIP viewing deck and wove his way through the chaotic labyrinth of the Apollo racing garage. Mechanics were swarming the sleek, matte black chassis of the Apollo V9, adjusting aero winglets and bleeding the hydraulic lines. The high-pitched whine of pneumatic wheel guns shrieked through the air, vibrating in Leo's teeth. At the back of the garage, in the driver's ready room, Mia Jackson was in the zone. She sat on a massage table, already clad in her fireproof Nomex underlayers, a set of heavy headphones clamped over her ears. Her eyes were closed, her head tilting slightly as she visualized the circuit, mentally braking, shifting, and accelerating through every corner. Her helmet, adorned with the striking gold and black Apollo livery, rested on the table beside her. Leo closed the door behind him, muffling the roar of the paddock. He reached out and tapped her knee. Jax's eyes snapped open. They were a piercing, predatory hazel. She pulled the headphones down to her neck, exhaling a long breath. "Tell me you fixed it, Leo. Tell me I'm not driving a 1,000-horsepower coffin tonight." "Julian locked the servers," Leo said, his voice a harsh, rushed whisper. "He called it Protocol Aegis. Total network blackout under the guise of security. I can't purge the brake sabotage from the pit wall." Jax's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in her cheek. She didn't panic. Elite drivers didn't panic. They calculated. "So, when I hit the braking zone at turn 14 at 200 miles an hour, the pedal goes to the floor and I go into the concrete. Unless I bypass the network entirely," Leo said, dropping his laptop onto a folding table and peeling the tape off his ankle. He pulled out the heavy, gunmetal flash drive and set it on the table with a dull clunk. "It's an offline executable. I'm going to write a hunter-killer script, a rogue counter algorithm. Once it's injected directly into the car's steering column port, it will isolate Julian's malware, quarantine the bad lines of code, and force the brake-by-wire system into a closed, mechanical loop. You won't have the smart braking assist, but you will have brakes." Jax stared at the drive. "You have to write a custom heuristic algorithm from scratch, compile it, and physically upload it to the car. In under 3 hours." "Yes. And if Julian catches you? He fires me. Then he probably has his syndicate friends throw me into the Marina Bay Harbor," Leo said, trying for a weak smile. "Failed." Jax stood up, grabbing her racing suit from the hanger. She zipped it up to her waist, the heavy fabric rustling in the quiet room. She stepped close to Leo, her gaze intense and unyielding. "I've spent my entire life fighting for a seat in this championship. I am not letting some corporate suit with a gambling problem take it from me. You write that code, Leo. You get it in the car. Whatever it takes." "I need a place to work," Leo said. "Julian is monitoring the network. If I boot up the compiler on the team Wi-Fi, he'll see the traffic." "The Pirelli tire warming tent," Jax said instantly. "Back of the paddock. It's deafening, it's 120 degrees, and the thermal interference from the blankets absolutely shreds Wi-Fi signals. No one goes back there until 40 minutes before the race. It's a dead zone." "Perfect." Leo grabbed his laptop and the drive. "I'll see you on the grid." "Leo," Jax called out as his hand hit the doorknob. He turned. "Don't miss." Leo slipped out of the ready room, pulling his team cap low over his eyes. The paddock was reaching a fever pitch. VIPs in silk shirts and glittering jewelry were being ushered through the hospitality suites. Camera crews from global sports networks roamed the pit lane like packs of hungry wolves, hunting for pre-race drama. Leo ducked behind a stack of spare front wings and slipped out the rear exit of the Apollo garage. The heat hit him immediately. Away from the air-conditioned bays, the Singapore night was a physical weight. He found the Pirelli tire tent at the edge of the paddock. It was exactly as Jax described, a massive canvas-lined oven. Stacks of slick racing tires were wrapped in heavy, electrically heated blankets, cooking the rubber to optimal grip temperatures. The smell of hot, off-gassing rubber was nauseating. The hum of the industrial generators powering the blankets was a relentless, vibrating drone. Leo found an empty crate in the darkest corner, sat down, and flipped open the tough book. He jammed the flash drive into the USB port. The screen cast a pale, blue glow over his sweating face. 02:05:12 until lights out. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second, and then he began to type. Code flowed across the screen in cascading lines of neon green. Leo fell into the rhythm, the chaotic noise of the paddock fading away, replaced by the pure, crystalline logic of syntax and structure. He had to build a backdoor into a system designed by the greatest automotive engineers on the planet. He had to disguise the counterscript as a standard telemetry handshake protocol, so the car's internal security wouldn't reject it. Sweat stung his eyes. He blinked it away, his fingers flying across the keys. Initialize override. Bypass checksum validation. Locate string. Hydraulic_pressure_bias. Execute quarantine. Time dilated. Minutes bled into hours. The battery indicator on his laptop ticked down ominously. Suddenly, the heavy canvas flap of the tent rustled. Leo froze, his fingers suspended above the keys. The hum of the generators masked the sound of footsteps, but a shadow stretched across the dusty floorboards, cast by the harsh floodlights outside. Check the thermal regulators, a voice barked. It was Marcus, Julian's head of trackside security, a mountain of a man who looked like he belonged in a mixed martial arts octagon, not an engineering bay. Mr. Thorne wants to ensure the rears are exactly at 90 degrees. Leo pressed himself flat against the canvas wall, holding his breath. His laptop screen was still glowing. He desperately pressed the brightness key, plunging the screen into total darkness just as Marcus rounded the stack of tires. Marcus paused, less than 5 feet away. He frowned, sniffing the air. He was looking right at the shadows where Leo crouched, hidden only by the narrow gap between 2 stacks of steaming rubber. A radio crackled on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus. Status. Julian's voice. Marcus keyed his mic. Tires are optimal, sir. No sign of Vance. His workstation is still empty. Find him. Julian's voice hissed through the static. The grid walk begins in 20 minutes. I want eyes on him. If he approaches the car, detain him. Use whatever pretext you need. Understood. Marcus turned on his heel and strode out of the tent. Leo let out a ragged exhale, his lungs burning. He flipped the screen brightness back up. 00:45:00 until lights out. He typed the final line of code. He hit compile. A progress bar appeared on the screen. It crawled with agonizing slowness. 10%, 34%, 68%. The ambient temperature in the tent was frying his laptop's processor. The cooling fans whined in protest, sounding like a dying jet engine. Come on, Leo muttered, watching the bar. 99%, 100%. Compilation successful. Leo yanked the flash drive from the port, slammed the laptop shut, and shoved it behind a stack of tires. He didn't need it anymore. Everything rested on the heavy piece of metal now burning a hole in his palm. He pushed out of the tent and into the blinding lights of the paddock. The atmosphere had shifted from chaotic to electric. The pre-race grid walk had begun. The cars had been pushed out of the garages and were now lined up on the starting grid, shimmering under the stadium lights. Thousands of people, mechanics, journalists, celebrities, and officials, swarmed the asphalt in a massive, vibrant sea of color and noise. The grandstands opposite the pit straight were a roaring wall of humanity, waving flags and sounding air horns that rattled the bones. Leo pushed his way through the throng. He kept his head down, weaving past a television crew interviewing a supermodel, ducking under a boom mic, and sliding between 2 rival mechanics. He spotted the Apollo V9. It was sitting in the 4th grid position. The car looked like a sculpted piece of pure violence, the carbon fiber bodywork absorbing the floodlights. Mechanics were swarming it, adjusting the front wing flaps, pumping dry ice into the side pods to keep the engine from cooking itself on the grid. Jax was already in the cockpit. Her helmet was on, the dark visor pulled down. She was strapped in, a prisoner to the machine. Standing right beside the cockpit, leaning over the Halo device and speaking into Jax's radio feed, was Julian. 00:12:00 until lights out. Leo's heart plummeted. Julian was guarding the port. The physical data connection was located on the left side of the cockpit, just below the carbon fiber steering column. Julian was standing exactly where Leo needed to be. Leo gripped the flash drive in his pocket. He couldn't wait. In 10 minutes, the grid would be cleared of all non-essential personnel. In 12 minutes, the formation lap would begin. He needed a distraction. Leo scanned the grid. To his left, one of the junior mechanics was wheeling a heavy trolley loaded with pressurized nitrogen tanks for the pneumatic systems. The mechanic was young, sweating profusely, and looking overwhelmed by the crowd. Leo didn't hesitate. He bumped hard into a passing cameraman, sending the man stumbling backward right into the trolley. The collision was spectacular. The heavy cart tipped over with a metallic crash. One of the nitrogen hoses snagged on a camera cable, snapping the valve open. A massive, deafening hiss erupted, and a thick plume of freezing white vapor exploded across the grid. The crowd screamed and scattered. The white cloud of nitrogen instantly engulfed the front of the Apollo V9. "Cut the valve! Cut the valve!" someone yelled. Julian recoiled, coughing and waving his hands to clear the vapor, stepping back from the cockpit. It was a window of seconds. Leo bolted. He dove through the dissipating white fog, sliding onto his knees right beside the left flank of the car. The heat radiating from the carbon fiber seared his skin through his jeans. He reached into the cockpit. Jax's gloved hand shot out, grabbing his wrist tightly for a split second. An acknowledgement. Then she let go. Leo found the rubber flap beneath the steering column. He flipped it open, exposing the data port. He jammed the flash drive into the slot. A small LED on the drive blinked red, then solid blue. Inside the cockpit, on Jax's steering wheel dashboard, a hidden prompt appeared beneath the standard telemetry dials. *override.exe initiated. Injecting countermeasures. 30 seconds, Leo. Jax's voice crackled faintly through the muffled helmet radio. Meant only for him. They're clearing the grid. The progress bar on the steering wheel dashed across the digital display. Isolating localized ECU. Quarantining hydraulic_pressure_bias. Rewriting mechanical loop. What the hell are you doing? The voice cracked like a whip over the noise of the grid. Leo froze. The vapor had cleared. Julian was standing over him, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Behind Julian, Marcus was pushing through the crowd, his eyes locked on Leo. "Step away from the car, Vance," Julian ordered, his voice dropping an octave, losing all its polished charm. He saw the flash drive sticking out of the port. "Pull that out. Now." Leo looked at the steering wheel display. 92%. 95%. "Just checking the physical connection, Julian," Leo said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts. He kept his hand hovering over the drive, blocking Julian's reach. "Protocol Aegis doesn't cover analog pin seating." "I said pull it." Julian lunged forward, his hand gripping Leo's shoulder with bruising force, hauling him backward. Leo stumbled, his boots slipping on the slick tarmac. But as he fell, his eyes caught the steering wheel one last time. 100%. Upload complete. System secure. Leo reached out and yanked the drive from the port just as Julian threw him to the asphalt. The heavy metal drive bounced out of Leo's hand, skittering under the car where no one could reach it. Julian stood over him, chest heaving, his immaculate polo shirt rumpled. He leaned down, his face inches from Leo's, his breath smelling of mint and malice. "You're done, Vance," Julian whispered. The words meant only for him. "You're fired. Security will escort you off the premises. And when this race is over, I promise you, you won't find a job calibrating tires at a go-kart track." A deafening air horn blasted across the circuit. *00:03:00 until lights out. All non-essential personnel clear the grid. The mechanics began pulling the tire blankets away. The car was dropped off its jacks, the tires hitting the ground with a heavy, final thud. Marcus hauled Leo to his feet by the collar of his shirt. "Time to go, hacker." As Marcus dragged him away from the car, Leo looked back. Julian was furiously inspecting the cockpit port, looking for any sign of a physical breach. But there was nothing left to find. The ghost was in the machine. Jax sat perfectly still in the cockpit. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't look at Leo. She simply reached down to the ignition switch. With a guttural, earth-shattering roar, the V6 hybrid engine fired to life, a mechanical beast screaming its defiance into the Singapore night. Leo smiled, blood pounding in his ears as Marcus dragged him toward the exit gates. The countdown clock hit 0. The formation lap began. The trap was set, but now the prey had teeth. The heat radiating from the asphalt of the Viridian circuit was a physical weight, thick and shimmering with the stench of unburned hydrocarbons and melting synthetic rubber. Inside the cockpit of the Valkyrie Mk4, Mia Jax Jackson existed in a microcosm of violent anticipation. She was strapped into the carbon fiber bucket seat by a 6-point harness pulled so tight it bruised her collarbones. The ambient temperature in the cabin was already cresting 110 degrees, but the sweat trickling down the nape of her neck beneath her fireproof balaclava was entirely cold. Through the tinted visor of her helmet, the world was reduced to the narrow slot of the track ahead and the high-definition glow of her digital heads-up display. The engine mounted inches behind her spine. A monstrous, hybrid-electric, twin-turbocharged V8 idled with a deep, percussive thrum that resonated through her ribs. It felt less like a machine and more like a caged apex predator, vibrating with the sheer, pent-up violence of 1,200 horsepower. "Comms check, Jax. Talk to me." The voice in her earpiece belonged to Leo Vance. It was startlingly clear, stripped of the ambient roar of the grandstands by the noise-canceling algorithms he had written himself. Despite the clarity, Jax could hear the tight, thrumming wire of anxiety beneath his calm cadence. "I hear you, Leo," Jax murmured, her hands gripping the suede-wrapped steering wheel. Her thumbs hovered over the array of rotary dials and primary ignition toggles. "Telemetry. Green across the board," Leo replied from the pit wall. "Engine mapping is optimal. Tire pressures are locked. The firewall is holding. For now." Jax exhaled slowly, watching the starter lights suspended above the grid. 5 massive red circles. "Keep them out of my head, Leo. Just let me drive. I've got your ghost, Jax. When the lights go out, you give them hell." High above the starting grid, in the climate-controlled, soundproof sanctuary of the VIP suite, Julian Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass. He held a crystal tumbler of single malt, the ice clinking softly in the quiet room. Down below, the grid was a chaotic tapestry of neon liveries, frantic pit crews, and the agonizing tension of the final seconds. Thorne's gaze, however, was fixed solely on the matte black chassis of the Valkyrie. He took a slow sip, the amber liquid burning pleasantly down his throat. Behind him, seated at a curved array of matte black monitors, a team of 3 syndicate operators typed in absolute silence. They were the architects of the Redline Sabotage, the digital assassins hired to ensure that Jax Jackson's defiance ended today. "Is the payload primed?" Thorne asked, his voice smooth, betraying none of the malice churning beneath his tailored silk suit. The lead operator, a pale man with wire-rimmed glasses reflecting lines of cascading hexadecimal code, nodded without looking up. "The zero-day exploit is nested in the track's broadcast telemetry ping. The moment her car crosses the start/finish line to begin lap 4, the handshake will execute. It will look like a routine data packet update. And the result? A catastrophic override of her electronic control unit," the operator replied, a faint, cruel smile touching his lips. "We will have absolute authority over her drive-by-wire systems. Throttle, braking bias, active aero, power steering. She will be a passenger in her own vehicle." Thorne turned back to the glass. Make it look like a tragic mechanical failure. The world needs to see that independent runners cannot survive the modern era. They need to learn that the syndicate's technology is the only path to survival. Down on the track, the first red light illuminated. A collective roar erupted from the 200,000 spectators, a sound that was immediately drowned out as 24 hypercombustion engines were brought up to launch control RPM. Second light. Jax felt the Valkyrie squat on its rear suspension, the pneumatic valves screaming in protest. Third light. She brought her left foot up, hovering the clutch paddle, her right foot pinning the throttle to the floorboard. The digital tachometer on her wheel flashed violently in the red zone. Fourth light. The world narrowed to a tunnel. Her breathing stopped. Fifth light. A heartbeat of agonizing suspension. The lights went out. Jax dumped the clutch. The physical assault of the acceleration was instantaneous and brutal. Force of force slammed her back into the seat as the rear tires bit into the sticky track surface, launching the Valkyrie forward like an artillery shell. The engine's roar was a physical shockwave, a deafening mechanical shriek that vibrated through her teeth. She blitzed past the two cars ahead of her before they even reached the first corner, her reaction time honed to a razor's edge by years of analog dirt track racing. She dove into the inside line of turn 1, slamming the ceramic brakes. The deceleration was just as violent as the launch, forcing the blood to rush to the front of her skull. She downshifted twice, crack, crack, the transmission violently engaging as she clipped the apex and rolled back onto the throttle. Perfect launch, Jax. Leo's voice cracked over the comms, buoyed by adrenaline. You're running P4. Heat in the tires is optimal. Pace is exactly where we mapped it. Copy, Jax grunted, fighting the steering wheel as the car danced over the exit curbs. For the first 3 laps, it was pure, unadulterated racing. Jax was in her element, an artist painting with kinetic energy and friction. She felt the micro-vibrations in the chassis, the exact threshold of grip in the Michelin slicks, the aerodynamic downforce pressing the car into the earth as she hit 190 miles per hour on the back straight. She surgically dismantled the driver in third place through a high-speed chicane, sliding the Valkyrie within millimeters of the concrete barrier, trusting her reflexes and the machine's balance over self-preservation. But as she crossed the start/finish line to begin lap 4, the invisible war began. In the pit lane, Leo Vance was hunched over a server rack jerry-rigged into a rolling flight case. His primary monitor displayed the Valkyrie's telemetry, hundreds of fluctuating graphs representing engine temperature, tire wear, fuel flow, and suspension load. Suddenly, a single innocuous green light on the bottom right corner of his network diagnostic screen flickered yellow, then instantly turned a bleeding, aggressive red. Leo's breath hitched. A warning klaxon chirped in his headset. Unauthorized packet injection. No, 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 Leo muttered, his fingers flying across his mechanical keyboard. He slammed a command to kill the external receiver, but the terminal threw back an access-denied error. The malware was already inside, unpacking itself with terrifying speed. It was a polymorphic worm, shifting its signature every millisecond, wrapping its tendrils around the Valkyrie's primary data bus. Jax! Leo shouted into the mic, his voice stripping away all the calm from before. They're in. The syndicate triggered the payload. On the track, Jax was entering the braking zone for turn 7, a sweeping, high-speed left-hander. She lifted her foot off the throttle to initiate the turn-in. The pedal didn't respond. The engine continued to scream at 8,000 RPM. The Valkyrie was still accelerating, blasting past 200 miles per hour. Leo! Jax yelled, slamming her foot onto the brake pedal. The ceramic discs clamped down, but the engine was still fighting them, the hybrid motors deploying maximum torque to the rear wheels. The car shimmied violently, the rear end breaking loose in a terrifying slide. Throttle is stuck open. I have no lift. Jax fought the steering wheel, her arms straining against the immense centripetal force as the car drifted toward the outer wall. She dumped the downshift paddle, forcing the transmission into a lower gear to engine brake, blowing past the red line. The engine wailed in mechanical agony, but the speed scrubbed just enough. She wrestled the car through the corner, the rear bumper grazing the concrete wall with a shower of sparks. "I'm locked out of the ECU," Leo yelled over the roar of the comms. Sweat was pouring down his face, stinging his eyes. On his screen, the syndicate's code was a spreading black cancer, devouring the system architecture. "They've encrypted the throttle mapping. I'm trying to inject the countermeasure we built, but their firewall is adapting heuristically. As a live hacker, Jax. Someone is actively fighting me on the network." Up in the VIP suite, Thorne watched the Valkyrie's violent drift. He frowned. She should have crashed. He turned to his lead operator. "Why is she still on the track?" "She overrode it mechanically by dumping the transmission," the operator said, his fingers a blur over his keyboard. "She's fighting the drive-by-wire. I am locking out the transmission actuators now, and I'm shifting the brake bias entirely to the front right tire. Next time she touches the brake, the car will spin out at terminal velocity." "Do it," Thorne commanded, his eyes cold. "End this." In the cockpit, the digital dash illuminated in a blinding crimson glow. A skull and crossbones motif, rendered in glitching ASCII art, flashed across Jax's visor HUD. The steering suddenly became impossibly heavy. The active power steering had been killed. Jax gritted her teeth, her biceps bulging as she forced the wheel to keep the car straight on the approaching straightaway. "Leo!" "Steering is dead. The dash is bleeding out. What is the play?" "Hold on," Leo screamed. In the pits, he was drowning in code. The syndicate hacker was deploying a denial-of-service attack against Leo's pit wall terminal, flooding his connection with junk data to blind him. Leo's hands moved with desperate precision. He opened a backdoor kernel he had hidden in the Valkyrie's air conditioning subsystem, an analog route that the syndicate wouldn't think to monitor. "I'm routing a bypass through the environmental controls," Leo said, his voice a rapid-fire staccato. "But they are rewriting the brake registries. Jax, listen to me. Do not touch the brakes. They've inverted the bias. If you brake, you will snap-roll the car." "Leo, I'm approaching the devil's hairpin," Jax screamed. The hairpin was a second-gear corner at the end of the longest straight. She was currently doing 212 miles per hour. The retaining wall at the end of the straight was a solid block of reinforced concrete, wrapped in a thin layer of tire barriers that would do nothing at this speed. "I have 3 seconds before the braking zone. I need more time," Leo shouted, launching a brute force decryption script against the brake registry. On his screen, the progress bar crawled. 20%, 34%. "I don't have time." Through the windshield, the concrete wall was rushing toward her at the length of a football field every second. The braking markers flashed past her peripheral vision. 150 meters. 100 meters. In the VIP suite, Thorne stepped closer to the glass, his breath fogging the pain. "Goodbye, Ms. Jackson. 50 meters. Leo." "I can't break the encryption." Leo realized the syndicate's code was too dense, the live operator too fast. He had a fraction of a second to make a catastrophic choice. He couldn't win the digital war, so he had to kill the battlefield. "Jax, brace for impact. I'm blowing the digital umbilical." Hard reboot of the entire chassis. Leo didn't wait for her confirmation. He bypassed the keyboard entirely, reaching under his terminal and smashing a red, physical kill switch wired directly to a localized EMP relay in the car's secondary battery. Inside the Valkyrie, everything died. The crimson glow of the HUD vanished. The screaming engine instantly cut out. The telemetry, the sensors, the syndicate's malware. All of it evaporated into sudden, terrifying silence. For a microsecond, the only sound was the deafening roar of the wind shearing over the carbon fiber chassis and the chaotic thumping of Jax's own heart. The car was completely dark. A 200-mile-per-hour dead weight. With the electronic throttle lockout dead, the mechanical systems reverted to their default, unpowered state. Jax didn't hesitate. Without power steering, the wheel was a concrete block. She planted both feet on the brake pedal, standing on it with every ounce of physical strength she possessed. The analog, unassisted hydraulic brakes clamped down on the carbon ceramic discs. The sheer friction generated a flash of blinding white light from the wheel wells. The tires shrieked, laying down for thick, black streaks of molten rubber on the asphalt. The G-force of the unassisted deceleration was barbaric. Jax felt the harness dig into her collarbones so hard she tasted blood. The car shuddered, bucking violently as the lack of an anti-lock braking system caused the front tires to lock up. Smoke billowed over the windshield, blinding her. She was sliding toward the wall, the smell of vaporized brake fluid and burning rubber flooding the cabin. "Bite!" Jax snarled through gritted teeth, muscling the dead steering wheel to the left, forcing the chassis to rotate. "Bite, you bastard!" The Valkyrie snapped sideways. The rear end swung out, missing the concrete retaining wall by a margin so thin it scraped the paint off the carbon fiber diffuser. The car drifted through the hairpin in a cloud of thick, acrid smoke, entirely sideways, propelled only by its own dying momentum. In the VIP suite, Thorne's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. The operator frantically smashed keys. "I've lost connection. The node is dead. She's off the grid." As the Valkyrie completed the arc of the hairpin, sliding into the exit lane, Leo held his breath in the pit box. He counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Rebooting in safe mode. Leo screamed, slamming the breaker switch back up. Inside the car, the dashboard flickered, glowing a clean, pristine blue. The engine control unit, wiped clean of the corrupted cache memory, reinitialized. The starter motor whined, and with a thunderous roar, the twin-turbo V8 fired back to life, spitting a 3-foot jet of blue flame from the exhaust. The power steering engaged. The throttle sync returned. Jax caught the slide, slammed the transmission into third gear, and buried the throttle. The Valkyrie shot out of the smoke cloud like a demon released from hell, the rear tires clawing for traction before gripping the asphalt and hurling her down the next straight. "Systems are green," Leo yelled, falling back into his chair, his hands shaking violently as adrenaline ravaged his nervous system. "We're air-gapped, Jax. The wireless receiver is fried. You are completely analog. No telemetry, no remote mapping, no safety nets. Just you and the machine." Jax dragged a deep, ragged breath into her lungs. Her arms felt like lead, and her chest ached from the seatbelts, but a fierce, predatory grin spread across her face beneath the helmet. She checked her mirrors. The cars she had passed were just entering the hairpin behind her. She had held her position. "Good," Jax said, her voice dropping to an icy, lethal calm. "Tell Thorne he missed his shot. Now it's my turn." She shifted into fourth gear, the engine howling its metallic war cry as she chased down the horizon, leaving the shadow of the syndicate in her dust. The scream of the V6 hybrid engine was no longer a symphony of engineering. It was a death rattle. Inside the subterranean gloom of the pit wall garage, the air was thick with the scent of ozone, burnt coffee, and the cold sweat of sheer panic. Leo Vance's fingers were a blur of bruising force against the keys of his mechanical keyboard, the staccato clacking swallowed entirely by the deafening roar of the track outside. On the bank of monitors curving around his workstation, the telemetry data was a chaotic, bleeding canvas of red. Critical failure. Override engaged. Throttle locked. 100%. Leo. The voice of Mia Jax Jackson cracked through the encrypted comms channel, the audio warped by the extreme vibration of the chassis and the sheer terror gripping her throat. "Leo, I have nothing. The brake-by-wire is dead. The pedal is a brick. Throttle is pinned. I'm a passenger in here. I'm in the network, Jax. Hold on. Just hold on," Leo said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm anchor in the storm of her earpiece. On the track, Jax's midnight blue and silver hyperchassis was a missile tearing down the Kemmel Strait. The speedometer on Leo's screen ticked upward with merciless precision. 205 miles per hour. 212 miles per hour. 218 miles per hour. At the end of the straight lay turn 8, the Devil's Hairpin. It was a notoriously brutal, decreasing radius left-hander that required an entry speed of no more than 45 miles per hour. If Jax hit that braking zone at her current speed, The carbon fiber monocoque wouldn't just crash. It would disintegrate. She would be dead before the chassis finished sparking against the reinforced concrete barriers. That was exactly what Julian Thorne and the syndicate had paid for. A tragic, high-speed anomaly. The perfect mechanical failure to cover up their billion-dollar betting fraud and silence the one driver who had figured out the cars were rigged. Distance to braking zone. 1,200 meters, Leo muttered, his eyes darting across a cascading waterfall of hexadecimal code. The malware Julian's operatives had injected into the car's electronic control unit was a masterpiece of digital sabotage. It was a polymorphic worm, constantly rewriting its own signature, burying itself deep within the battery management system and locking out the manual hydraulic overrides. Every time Leo tried to flash the firmware with a clean backup, the worm violently rejected the handshake, throwing up walls of military-grade encryption. 900 meters, Leo! Jax screamed over the roar of wind and engine. Her breathing was ragged, the G-forces already tearing at her neck as the aerodynamic downforce pinned the car to the asphalt. I'm trying to downshift. The gearbox is rejecting the input. I know, I see it. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The world around him, the frantic pit crew, the screaming fans in the grandstands above, the smell of high-octane racing fuel, faded into a tunnel of pure, crystalline focus. He didn't have time to systematically dismantle the worm. He had to blow the bridge. Leo pulled up the decrypted data logs he had salvaged from the Syndicate's shadow server the night before. The logs contained the architectural blueprint of Julian's entire network, including the root access protocols the Syndicate used to communicate with the dormant malware. 600 meters. Jax's voice was a ragged gasp. Leo, tell my dad. You tell him yourself, Jax? Leo snapped. Brace for deceleration. Leo isolated the car's MGUK, the kinetic motor generator unit. Instead of trying to purge the worm from the ECU, Leo weaponized the car's own hybrid energy system. He slammed a command sequence into the terminal, executing a forced feedback loop. He was going to overload the CAN bus network with a localized electromagnetic spike, intentionally crashing the car's entire operating system to reboot it into safe mode. Warning: system reset will disable all electronic assists. Do it, Leo hissed and slammed the enter key. For a microsecond, the monitors in the pit garage went entirely black. On the track, 300 meters from the hairpin, Jax's car plunged into darkness. The digital dash on her steering wheel blinked out. The screaming pitch of the hybrid system died. The throttle, previously locked wide open by the malicious code, instantly cut out. System rebooting, manual hydraulics engaged. Leo breathed, watching a single, blinking green light appear on his primary monitor. I have the pedal, Jax roared. At 220 miles per hour, with less than 200 meters to the apex of the hairpin, Jax stomped on the heavy, unassisted brake pedal with every ounce of strength in her legs. The deceleration was violent, apocalyptic. 5.5 GS of negative force slammed Jax forward against her 6-point titanium harness, bruising her collarbones instantly. The massive carbon ceramic brake discs erupted into glowing rings of blinding, superheated orange fire, spewing showers of incandescent sparks as the calipers bit down with bone-crushing pressure. The rear tires locked, screaming in agony against the hot tarmac, sending up thick plumes of acrid white smoke. The car violently snapped sideways, initiating a massive, terrifying drift. To the 100,000 spectators in the grandstands, it looked like a catastrophic loss of control. To Leo, watching the telemetry sensors frantically blink back to life, it was a ballet of pure, unadulterated instinct. Jax countersteered, her hands a blur of precision. She caught the slide just as the rear diffuser kissed the red and white painted curbing of the apex. The car danced on the razor's edge of physics, the titanium skid blocks throwing a tidal wave of sparks into the air as she wrestled the machine through the hairpin, missing the concrete barrier by a fraction of an inch. She cleared the corner. The tires found their grip. Systems online. Throttle mapped to manual. Leo shouted, surging out of his chair, his fists planted on the desk. Copy that. Jax yelled, her voice vibrating with a lethal mixture of adrenaline and rage. She slammed the shifter paddle. The V6 engine howled back to life, furious and unrestricted. She had survived the trap, but the race wasn't over. Coming out of the hairpin, she was in second place, trailing the race leader, a driver secretly backed by Julian's syndicate, by a mere 2 seconds. 2 laps to go, Jax, Leo said, his voice dropping an octave, settling into a cold, predatory rhythm. The ghost is purged. The car is yours. Show them what you can do. With pleasure. The final 2 laps were a masterclass in aggression. Freed from the parasitic drag of the syndicate's micro-adjustments, the car performed perfectly. Jax drove like a demon unleashed from hell. She ate the gap in a single lap, her lap times dropping by impossible margins. She rode the slipstream of the leader down the main straight, the 2 cars mere inches apart, tearing through the air at 200 miles per hour. As they approached the final chicane, the syndicate driver moved to block the inside line. It was a dirty, desperate move, but Jax didn't flinch. She feinted left, forcing him to commit, then violently threw the car to the right, braking impossibly late. She dove down the outside line, her left side tires dipping into the dirt, kicking up a rooster tail of dust and grass. She held the momentum around the outside, the lateral GS threatening to snap her neck, and pulled ahead as they crossed the apex. The crowd erupted, the sound a physical wave that shook the foundations of the pit lane. Jax flattened the throttle. The checkered flag waved furiously from the starter's stand, a blur of black and white, signaling the end of the nightmare. She crossed the finish line a full second ahead of the pack. P1 Jax, P1. Leo screamed into the radio, the tension breaking over him like a shattered dam. He sank back into his chair, running his trembling hands over his face, laughing a breathless, exhausted laugh. "We did it, Leo," Jax replied, her voice breaking with emotion as she began her cool-down lap. "We actually did it. Bring her home safely. The real work is just starting." Leo didn't wait for the car to pull into park firm. He reached behind his workstation, his fingers finding the encrypted, solid-state hard drive he had plugged into the mainframe. He yanked it free, its metallic casing warm to the touch. This drive held the decoded telemetry logs, the rootkit source code, the offshore bank routing numbers, and the undeniable digital fingerprints of Julian Thorne's illicit empire. Leo slipped the drive into his jacket pocket and walked out of the garage, stepping into the chaotic, sun-drenched frenzy of the paddock. The atmosphere was electric, swarming with journalists, mechanics, and VIPs. But Leo's eyes were locked on a single figure standing near the entrance of the VIP hospitality suite. Julian Thorne, the billionaire team owner, looked immaculate in his tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, but the mask of aristocratic invulnerability was slipping. His jaw was locked tight, his eyes darting frantically toward the giant monitors, replaying Jax's impossible survival at the hairpin. He held a crystal glass of champagne, but his knuckles were white. He had expected a crash. He had expected silence. Instead, he was watching the total collapse of his syndicate's control over the championship. Leo marched straight through the parting crowd, his boots heavy on the paddock asphalt. Julian saw him coming. The older man's eyes narrowed, a flash of pure, venomous hatred crossing his features before he forced his mouth into a tight, condescending smile. "Vance," Julian said smoothly as Leo approached. "A spectacular finish. Truly. I must admit, I thought Mia had lost it at turn 8. A miraculous recovery." "It wasn't a miracle, Julian," Leo said, his voice quiet, deadly, carrying only to the men immediately surrounding them. "It was a firmware flash." Julian's smile froze. The champagne in his glass trembled ever so slightly. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Your technical babble has always been a bit over my head." "You know exactly what I mean." Leo stepped closer, entirely unfazed by the 2 massive security contractors who stepped up to flank Julian. The rootkit in the battery management system, the locked throttle, the forced overrides. You tried to kill her. "Careful, Leo," Julian whispered, his voice dropping to a silken threat. Defamation is a very ugly thing, especially when aimed at a man who employs you. You're emotional, the heat of the race. I suggest you go cool down before you say something that ruins your entire career. My career is fine, Leo said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the solid-state drive, holding it up so it caught the harsh glare of the paddock lights. Yours, on the other hand, is over. Julian's gaze snapped to the small rectangular drive. For a fraction of a second, the polished billionaire looked like a cornered animal. What is that? Everything, Leo said simply. The decrypted telemetry logs from the last 3 seasons. The source code for the malware you used to manipulate the cars. The IP addresses of the shadow servers. The direct, unencrypted wire transfers from your offshore accounts to the illegal betting syndicates in Macau and Monaco. Julian swallowed hard, his throat clicking. You're bluffing. The encryption was absolute. Nothing is absolute, Leo replied. I broke your ghost, Julian. On the track and in the code. Before Julian could issue a command to his security detail, the heavy thud of multiple car doors slamming shut echoed through the paddock. A fleet of black, unmarked SUVs had pulled up to the security gates. Men and women in dark windbreakers emblazoned with the insignias of Interpol, the FIA Integrity Unit, and federal authorities poured out, their expressions grim and purposeful. Julian took a step back, his eyes widening in raw panic. You called them? I sent them a teaser file 20 minutes ago, right before the race ended, Leo said, his eyes cold and unblinking. Told them I'd have the rest of the puzzle waiting for them at the finish line. The lead federal agent, a tall woman with steel-gray eyes, flanked by 2 armed Interpol officers, approached the group. She didn't look at Leo. Her gaze was locked entirely on Julian. Julian Thorne? She asked, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the celebrating paddock. This is absurd, Julian stammered, his aristocratic veneer finally shattering into 1,000 pieces. Do you know who I am? I own this team. I bring hundreds of millions of dollars to this sport. You're under arrest, Mr. Thorne, the agent said, stepping forward. Suspicion of massive fraud, illegal gambling operations, conspiracy, and attempted murder. One of the officers stepped behind Julian, pulling his arms back. The metallic snick-snack of the handcuffs ratcheting closed was the sweetest sound Leo had ever heard. Take the drive, Leo said, handing the solid-state drive to the lead agent. It's completely unlocked. The directories are mapped. It's all there. The agent took it, nodding respectfully at Leo. Good work, Mr. Vance. We'll need you in for a full deposition. I'll be there, Leo said. Julian struggled against the officers as they began to march him away, his bespoke suit pulling awkwardly across his shoulders. He twisted his head back, his face purple with rage. You're dead, Vance. The syndicate won't let this go. You hear me? You're a dead man. Leo didn't bother to answer. He simply watched as the architect of so much suffering, the man who had poisoned the sport he loved, was shoved into the back of an SUV. The doors slammed shut, cutting off Julian's frantic threats, and the convoy sped away, leaving nothing but the smell of exhaust in its wake. Hey, tech boy. Leo turned. Jax was walking toward him through the parted crowd. She was still in her fireproof racing suit, the top half unzipped and tied around her waist. Her face was streaked with sweat, grease, and the faint tracks of tears, but her eyes were brighter than the sun. In one hand, she carried her carbon fiber helmet. In the other, a massive, gold-plated first-place trophy. The crowd around them began to cheer again, cameras flashing in a blinding strobe, but for a moment, it felt as though they were the only 2 people in the world. Leo let out a long, shuddering breath, the adrenaline finally leaving his system, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. A slow smile spread across his face. You drive pretty well for someone who doesn't need brakes, Leo said. Jax laughed, a rich, genuine sound that cut through the noise of the paddock. She closed the distance between them and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. Leo hugged her back fiercely, feeling the trembling in her muscles, the shared relief of survival and vindication. "We got him," Jax whispered against his ear. "We really got him." "We got them all," Leo corrected softly. They pulled back, Jax resting her hand on his chest. She looked up at the towering grandstands, where the fans were still chanting her name, completely unaware of the invisible war that had just been fought and won beneath their feet. The sun was beginning to set over the circuit, casting long golden shadows across the asphalt. The stench of Julian's corruption was gone, blown away by the wind and the roar of the engines. The sport belonged to the drivers again. It belonged to the truth. "Come on," Jax said, her eyes shining as she grabbed Leo's hand, pulling him toward the podium where the champagne was waiting. "Let's go celebrate a clean win." Leo squeezed her hand, stepping out into the golden light. For the first time in his life, there were no ghosts in the machine. There was only the open road ahead and the triumphant, unyielding wave of the checkered flag.